Harry's work has been really instrumental in learning about and disclosing about how police make arrests, especially drug arrests, and whether there's a kind of a social fairness or social injustice in the way they select people on the basis of drugs. You know, whether you're wearing a tie and have a gray beard, or whether you have, you know, you look different and you're wearing.
Yeah. Can I say good morning? Yes, please.
Of course.
Good morning. I'm Angela Chico. I'm the General Counsel for the NAACP, and I came up from Baltimore this morning. I'm sorry.
Well, welcome, welcome. Okay.
It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Like other people presenting today, my co-authors and I wrote a long paper, which is actually in the binders that you have, and will also be available through the council and on their website and through the publication Gene Watch. In my brief time, I'm going to try to touch on probably too many of the points in the paper. As Shelley said, I do research on drug policy. My recent and current work focuses on drug arrests, especially the lowest level of those arrests, the many seemingly innocuous misdemeanor arrests for drug possession, particularly arrests for possession of small amounts of marijuana. It turns out, with the continued expansion of DNA collection to more and more offenses of declining severity, and with the building of local, state, and especially national DNA databases in the U.S., these petty drug arrests have taken on considerable political relevance, including, or especially even, in New York City and in New York State. The punchline or point of this paper and of my presentation here is easy to summarize and to say clearly. Drug arrests are racially skewed or biased. Blacks and Latinos are arrested for drug offenses, especially just for possessing small amounts of drugs, at several or more times the rate of whites. However, whites use drugs and possess drugs more than blacks and Latinos, but blacks and Latinos are arrested far more than whites. The effect of this pattern has been to produce DNA databases that are already unfairly racially biased, and that, as they expand, are increasingly so. The segregation laws in the United States that ran for 89 years, from 1876 to 1965, were commonly called Jim Crow laws. We suggest that the United States has been building what can properly be called Jim Crow's DNA database. To call attention to the phenomena, in this phenomena, in no way cast aspersion on collection of DNA evidence on crime scenes. Methodically collecting and storing evidence from crime scenes, especially for violent crimes like murder and rape, has long been part of good policing. In recent years, scientific and laboratory techniques have increased the likelihood of obtaining DNA information from that evidence. Over 200 people in the United States, over 200 people convicted of serious crimes have been found innocent, and useful leads for many other crimes have developed through the use of DNA contained in evidence at crime scenes. Scrupulous professional collection of forensic evidence, including DNA at crime scenes, is wise, sensible policy. However, building huge and ever-growing criminal justice DNA databases of potential suspects with DNA from people convicted of misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies, or even just arrested for them, is another matter entirely. As the collection of DNA at crime scenes has increased, collecting the DNA of individuals for criminal justice databases has increased much more. According to the Washington Post, by 2006, the U.S.'s data bank of DNA fingerprints is growing by more than 80,000 people a month. This graph 1, shows the growth in the forensic profiles, that is crime scene DNA evidence, and offender profiles, that is DNA from individuals, in CODIS, the U.S. government's national DNA database and the largest DNA data bank in the world. As of January 2008, there were 200,000 forensic DNA profiles, but 5.5 million DNA profiles of individuals. The red line shows the forensic or crime scene DNA profiles. The blue line, obviously, the individual offender ones. We're closing on 6 million individual profiles. The dramatic growth in DNA collected from individuals is the result of federal government, states, and local jurisdictions making increasing numbers of crimes of decreasing severity DNA swipeable. As Simoncelli and Primsky have recently explained, the earliest state statutes, dating back to the 1990s, limited collection and retention of DNA samples to sexual offenders on the theory that those persons were especially prone to recidivism and most likely to leave behind biological evidence. Successes in linking DNA to some high-profile murder and rape cases, combined with an eagerness on the part of politicians to appear tough on crime, prompted states to expand their data banks in leaps and bounds. Today, 44 states collect DNA from all felons, 28 from juvenile offenders, and 39 from those who commit some misdemeanors. Although police, prosecutors, and politicians have effectively advocated for expansion of DNA collection from individuals, the databases raise enormous ethical, political, civil liberties, scientific, and technical problems. And other speakers today are going to talk about the substantial technical problems with the databases, about how DNA is not infallible, that it's subject to errors in handling and interpretation, that these errors are increased as the databases increase, and that the civil liberties issues as well, involved in what Edward Kennedy has called the most personal and private information there is. However, leaving aside all the major ethical, technical, and civil liberties problems posed by the databases, there's a separate question, which is who are the people most affected by recent, current, and proposed expansion of DNA criminal justice databases? The answer, much more than has been discussed or even understood, is blacks and Latinos, above all, young black and Latino men. And the single class of offenses from which more blacks and Latinos have been arrested is drug offenses, especially low-level and nonviolent drug offenses. In 2006, there were nearly 2 million arrests in the United States for drug offenses. This is slightly less than the arrests for all violent crimes and all property crimes combined. I've been collecting information about drug arrests in New York City. Drug arrests constitute over 20%, actually almost 25% in some years, of all arrests in New York City. About half of those are misdemeanors for possessing small amounts of marijuana. The drug arrests and their racial bias in New York are extreme and dramatic, but they are by no means unique. Because New York is so large, because it has been arresting so many people on petty drug charges, and because other jurisdictions in the U.S. are also making such arrests, looking closely at arrests in New York City and New York State makes it easier to see what's been occurring elsewhere in the U.S., and especially what expanding the databases can be expected to produce almost everywhere. Since 1973 and the passage of the infamous Rockefeller drug laws, New York State has led in what has become known as the war on drugs. Nationally, the drug war has become the great engine of imprisonment in the U.S. People incarcerated for drug offenses currently make up about 1/4 of the 2 million U.S. prisoners. In New York State, 90% of the people imprisoned on drug charges are black and Latino, mostly young men convicted of low-level and nonviolent offenses. As the organization Human Rights Watch has pointed out, overwhelmingly people in New York State were not violent offenders. They were street-level dealers selling small quantities, bit players in the drug trade. These are people in prison on felonies. All of the people currently incarcerated in New York State prisons for drug offenses, and many who preceded them, largely black and Latino, are now part of the state's DNA database, which in May of 2007 had profiles of nearly 250,000 people. Since the 1990s, police, prosecutors, and politicians in New York have pushed to increase the number of people with DNA permanently filed in the state's criminal justice data banks. New York City's mayors and police commissioners have led the campaign, urging that more and more offenses become DNA swipeable. Howard Safer, Mayor Giuliani's close ally and second police commissioner, was early on a prominent national advocate for collecting what he termed DNA fingerprints. In 2007, then Governor Eliot Spitzer proposed to collect DNA from anyone convicted of any offense whatsoever. His legislation was passed by the state Senate, but it was halted temporarily by the New York State Legislature, with black and Latino legislators playing very important leadership roles in the stopping of that. In January of 2008, just a few months ago, Mayor Michael Bloomberg of New York City said in his State of the City address, he proposed to collect DNA from everyone arrested for anything. Although few outside of the legislature realized it at the time, or have since, if either Spitzer's bill or Bloomberg's bill was put into effect, New York's DNA databases would be flooded with new misdemeanor cases, over half from New York City, mostly young Black and Latino men. Since 1997 and continuing to this day, New York City has been engaged in a massive undeclared marijuana possession arrest crusade. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that's been like. From 1997 to 2006, this bar right here, New York arrested and jailed over 350,000 people, jailed them overnight, for possessing, not selling, for possessing small amounts of marijuana, usually a few grams in a little bag or a cigarette. This was a tenfold increase over the previous decades. Marijuana possession misdemeanors have constituted over 10% of all arrests in New York City. In 2007, last year, New York arrested another 39,700 people, bringing the 11-year total to nearly 400,000 misdemeanor marijuana possession arrests. It's important to understand that most of the people arrested were not smoking marijuana, and they were certainly not selling it. Generally, they had a few grams concealed in their pocket or belongings. Police found the marijuana by stopping and searching people, often by tricking or intimidating them into taking it out, or flat out illegally searching them. When the marijuana was found or brought out, the police arrested the people and charged them with possessing marijuana in public view. The governor's proposed DNA database legislation would cover many of these arrests. The mayor's proposed legislation would cover all of them. This graph shows the total misdemeanor arrests from 1977 to 2006. Most of the people arrested are between ages 16 and 26 years of age, and 90% are male. Graph 3 shows the marijuana possession arrests from 1997 to 2006 by race. Of the 353,000 possession arrests, 52% were of blacks, 31% were of Hispanics, and less than 15% were of whites. From 1997 to 2006, New York arrested 185,000 black people, 110,000 Hispanics, and 53,000 whites simply for possessing marijuana. This breaks down the arrests for the last 21 years, showing the portion of the arrests for each year that were of whites, Hispanics, and blacks. Since the beginning of this marijuana crusade, blacks have been about 26% of the population, but 52% of the arrests. Hispanics have been about 27% of the population, 31% of the arrests, and non-Hispanic whites have been about 36% of New York's population, but only 15% of the whites. And this is 2007, the most recent figures, only out just a couple of months ago. This graph shows the marijuana arrests, this graph shows the rate of arrests of white, blacks, and Hispanics, calculated by the number of each group in New York as a whole. It takes the 11-year average. Since 1997, Hispanics have been arrested, and probably these numbers are higher than this. Since 1997, Hispanics have been arrested at nearly 3 times the rate of whites. Blacks are arrested at 5 times the rate of whites. What about use? Do blacks and Latinos use marijuana more than whites? And is that why so many more of them are getting arrested for possessing it? Graph 6 shows the marijuana use of whites, blacks, and Hispanics aged 18 to 25. The majority of the people arrested for possessing marijuana in New York City are in this age group or younger. This data comes from the U.S. government's National Survey of Households, now formerly called the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. The graph shows lifetime use, last year use, last month use. For each category, it shows 2 sets of columns, one with the 2002-2003 figures, one with the 2004-2005 figures. So we got 4 years of data here. Yeah, the most recent data and surveys from previous years show the same thing, and some local New York State and even New York City data show exactly the same thing. A greater percentage of whites have used marijuana than have blacks and